Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Patterns with a Purpose, How to Read Africa's Living Landscapes, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine earned an honors degree in nursing in Bristol and worked as an intensive care sister for a decade in the UK before returning to her native Africa and becoming certified as a Big Five vehicle-based walking guide. She founded her own training company, Africa Nature Training, in 2002 and has been sharing her expertise through guiding at the Matakwe Game Reserve and writing her column, The Wild Guide, in South African travel magazine since 2017. Born and raised in Zimbabwe, Lorraine combines her medical background with extensive guiding certifications and has explored numerous national parks across the USA, Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe throughout her career. Lorraine, as always, it's amazing to have you here on Daily Dose. The show is yours. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. As always, great to be here. And as you said, I called this Patterns with a Purpose, and with a sort of a subtext of a guide style approach to decoding what plants, soils, and slopes or the landscape are telling you. I think very often when we go out into nature, our focus is very much on the animals that we're looking for, and that's completely understandable. But I think in the last presentation I looked at some of the hidden ecological processes that happen, which have influences on where we see animals, how nutrients are moved, from like the Magadi pans all the way across large parts of southern Africa, bringing nutrients, from those more desert areas into areas which, when it rains, go into the soils. And what I wanted to do in this presentation is just look a little bit more, I guess, at a local scale, and from a guide's perspective. How are we interpreting what we see? Nothing in the environment is random. Animals don't just wander around randomly. For the most part, if we're now talking about herbivores, they are following where the type of plants and food supplies they need grow, and then you'll find them exactly where those particular plants grow. And there are signals, if you will, in the landscape that give you clues as to where is going to be the best place to be looking for specific animals, birds, insects, reptiles. And I tried to just find a framework to put that into, and I sort of came down with four what I've called signal types. So one of those, with that kudu in the top corner, I called structure. And that's looking at what is the grass height, what are the tree densities, because that will drive what animals you'll find there. Certain herbivores are happy in that environment, others would be extremely uncomfortable, like wildebeest, for example. That would not be their environment. The colors that I'm talking about here, and we'll talk quite a bit more about that as we go, is looking at soils. So the color of soils are very indicative of the types of vegetation you're going to find in an area. So this very black soil in this picture, these are what are known as vertic clays, and it's soil that becomes incredibly waterlogged and incredibly hard when it's dried. So it's very difficult as an environment for plants to grow in. And so it creates a very specific type of landscape. when we look at texture, I'm talking there more about things like this you would consider almost a smooth lawn. So it's a grazing lawn. The warthog in the picture there have actually done quite a lot of digging. So I think it was pretty bumpy, but nonetheless, the type of grass growing there, it's a grass called cynodon. It produces lots of runners. It doesn't grow upwards, it grows outwards. And it gives you these grazing lawns, as opposed to more clumpy grasses, which may grow a lot taller. And then patterns. We'll speak about something tonight called a katina, and I'll explain that as we go. But often we find patterns in the landscape. So whether that's driven by rocky ridges, whether that's driven by particular soil types down a slope. So there are repeating patterns that you find. And so these are the things from a guide's perspective that we need to consider when we're looking for animals and taking people on a guided experience. So this was just another picture just to look at color. So I said to you that those very dark black soils were very heavy clay. These red soils are sandy very often, very rich in iron oxide, which is what's making them red. And you'll have a totally different vegetation structure. As opposed to those grazing lawns, what you can see here is much more coarse grass. And this is favored by bulk grazers. So things that don't really care about the quality, but they need quantity. And so not this nice grazing lawn, but a much more coarse and fibrous environment. And then looking at structure, I mean, here you can see that you've got a variety of trees, some taller, some shrubs, intermingled with grasses that give you a particular topography in which you're going to find your animals. And then this is an example. It's not a great example, but it was kind of one of the pictures I had of patterns in the landscape. So this is on a sandy crest at Mala Mala in the Lowveld. And as you can see, you've got clumps of trees interspersed with sort of shrubs, with grasses. But the overall pattern here is quite an open landscape. And that's what you would expect on a sandy crest, as opposed to down in a valley. So how do these landscape components interact? Nothing acts in isolation. So you have water, which is now coming in the form of rainfall. It infiltrates into the soil. And the way in which the soil processes that, be it clay, be it sand, will then have a specific vegetative response. And so the interesting thing about vegetation is it will tell you something about current conditions, and it will give you historical information. So you can see areas that have been heavily overgrazed. You can see evidence of fire. All of these interactions start to create this picture for you as a guide as to where you're going to look for specific animals. So I was trying to come up with ideas that would help people when going out into an environment, especially one that they've never been in before. And I came up with this idea of, so look for differences, scan for differences in color, look for tall versus short, look at the big picture, look at the backdrop, if you will, and then start asking questions. So comparisons are a good one. there's two areas, they get exactly the same rainfall, but they look completely different. So why is that? Is it the soil? Is it the topography? What is making or creating that difference? And then in terms of explaining, you may or may not be able to explain what the driving force behind this is, but you'll probably get some sort of an idea. Is it the water that's accumulating? Is it something in the soil texture that's changed? Could it be a nutrient hotspot, something like a termite mound? Is it past disturbance? It's really interesting in areas that have previously been cattle farms, for example. Cattle will often go to areas in a corner where there have been two fences. And the vegetative structure in the corners, previous corners of these cattle farms is different to the vegetation a few yards away. So it will start, when you start looking for these sort of subtle clues, you start to be able to almost interpret the patterns. And that leads to something that, for want of a better term, is a type of ecological literacy. So I just want to show you in these two photographs something about how different two landscapes in the same environment overall can be. So this was taken in the Sabi Sands. This is a granite outcrop. So at the top of a crest, large granite boulders, sort of a smattering of trees and bushes. And then in exactly the same localized area, you now have something that looks like this. So you've got much more grass, sandy soils, much denser vegetation. You've even got, some sort of palms and, a whole interspersing of trees and grasses that look very different to that picture. So what is driving those differences? Why does it look so different? I mean, they're both in the same area. And it's largely to do with where are they? Where are these areas on a slope? And something to do with the underlying soil types. Okay, so I mentioned in the beginning that I would talk about something called a catena. And a catena really is a term used sort of geologically that talks about related soils as they go down a slope. So there's a single parent rock. So in the instance of areas like the Sabi Sands, for example, it's granite. And as water moves and the soil forms, you start to get a pattern down a slope. And it's very interesting when you start being able to pick out these patterns, because you start to see all the differences as you go down in terms of the vegetation and the animals. So the top or the crest, very often sandy soils in these granite environments. And then as the water is leaching down into the substrate and then running down both overland and through the actual subsurface, it doesn't only take water moving, it starts to move the smaller clay particles that are part of the soil and the decomposing rock with it. And so what you start to see is an aggregation of clays as you go down the slope. And as that happens, it starts to support a different vegetative structure, which in turn will then drive the animals that you're going to find. So water doesn't just fall, it chooses a path. And so when you're talking about these sandy soils, it goes in vertically, recharges the soil, but at depth, but the surface is very often dry. And then as the slope steepens, or you may have a saturation, water actually starts to come up to the surface. We call this a seep line. And then it continues to carry clay particles down the slope. If you think about the bottom areas, they're also receiving direct rainfall, but they're also collecting this runoff. And that's what starts giving you these richer, heavier soils that support different vegetation to the ones that you get up on the top of the slope. So this is just an infographic just to perhaps kind of make it a little more visible. So here you can see fast infiltration, low holding capacity. And often what happens is the nutrients leach down and you get something known as a hard pan. So that can vary. It can be in some areas where there's a lot of iron, you get ferrocrete forming. In areas where there's more calcium, you get calcrete forming. And very often that is a limiting factor for how deep roots can go because it forms this almost impenetrable barrier. And often in these areas, you've got more what we would call broadleaf trees that are less nutritious than some of the trees growing at the bottom of the slope in clay, which often have nitrogen-fixing bacteria nodules on their roots. And that means that in those areas, you'll often get sweet grasses and fine leaf trees. It also can be quite chemically rich. And sometimes there are areas where we talk about sodic soils. And sodic soils are areas that are actually, we call it quite friable. They're quite prone to damage. And it's one of the areas from a guiding perspective that you don't want to be driving off-road on because the actual damage through compaction and disturbance you can do can be very long-lasting. So coming back to that concept of a katina, plants track soils. So not literally. We don't have walking trees. Although I was joking earlier with Rob that I didn't reverse into a tree with my car the other day, that the tree actually jumped out. But in terms of tracking soils, what I mean by that is that if you start to see shifts in woody cover or ground vegetation, it's probably reflecting this invisible soil boundary below it that you can't see, but which is indicating to you that something is going on. And so this just shows you how these trees track down the slope. So starting at the crest, those sort of granite outcrops, and then coming down, you start getting more of your some of your acacia species as the soil becomes more clay. There are in Southern Africa, at least, we lost the name acacia a few years ago. So when we talk scientifically, we have to talk about Bachelia and Senegalia. But when talking in non-technical language, they are still acacias to us. And then once you start to get down into the riverine or the riparian zones, that's where you start seeing your lush, dense vegetation and your very dark alluvial soils. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the trees and the animals that you're going to see in each of these areas. So this is actually a marula tree, not one with many leaves on it at this particular time, but this is typical of crest areas in this environment. So good visibility, often a good scan zone for leopard. In February, always a good area to look for elephants because that's when the marula trees fruit, and elephants love marulas. And it greens up really quickly after rain, but it loses that almost as quickly because it's not holding the water. So this young leopard was one that did read the book and is beautifully posing in a marula tree on top of a sandy crest. This slightly more disdainful looking leopard that was also, it's not a marula tree, but also on a sort of sandy crest area. And then elephants often seen in these areas as well, because they'll come, and this one has been stripping bark off the trees, something that often happens in the dry season in these areas. And then you get the more clay area. So we spoke about the sort of mid-slope, and this is an area that you would consider looking for buffalo, zebra, and this particular tree here is known as a silver cluster leaf, and it's quite indicative of these more sort of seep line areas where you'll often get water also coming to the surface. So as I said, buffalo, they always look at you as though you owe them money. And things like zebra, they are quite typically found in these areas. And you can see it's kind of more shrubby and tall grasses. And then right down the bottom, you start to get to your foot slopes and your drainage lines. And these are the areas, particularly in the dry season, that you are going to be looking for animals, because you'll see this green sort of line, if you will, and these are the zones where even if there's no water visible above ground, there's often quite a lot of water below ground, and these often then form pathways for things like elephants to move along, and then also animals like waterbuck. You'll find them in these sort of lower lying areas. So another thing to look at is, and one thing I think that many people do not look at, is the soils. And the soils are incredibly important. So if you look at the colors of soils, if you see these very dark blue-gray soils, those are the waterlogged soils. Poor drainage, quite hard on plants, only specific plants can deal with them. The yellowish gray soils are often the ones that are the leached nutrients. So water's gone through them and taken out the nutrients and taken those down to a hard pan. The iron-rich ones are the red ones, often very old soils, often found on crests. But in places like Madikwe, for example, there's a lot of red soils, and that's all wind-blown or aeolian soils from the Kalahari. And then the sort of brown, rich color soils, those are your loam-type soils. So that's a mixture of sand and clay, often mixed in with a lot of organic matter. And those are often your fertile soils with relatively good drainage. So another thing we look at is what is the actual surface, if you will, of the soil layer look like. So if you have areas of bare ground that looks very cracked and crusted like this, that's often signaling that there's a stress in that environment, be that drought, be it heavy grazing, be it trampling from too many animals. And one of the problems with this is that it stops infiltration of water and it increases runoff. And so what happens is you then start to get erosion developing. Seedlings will not germinate in that. And so that area quickly becomes quite degraded. Compare that to the healthy cover picture, where you've got this kind of almost a living sponge You've got a grass layer that's supplying nutrients. You've got infiltration. It's slowing runoff because it's absorbing the water, and therefore your erosion risk becomes a lot less. So this would be an environment that you would consider to be in a functional state, as opposed to one that looks more like that on the left-hand side, which obviously is a much more degraded area. So if you look at these components, so if you look at the slope, the soil, and water, you can start to see the pattern behind the plants. So if you look at slope and you start to see vegetation bands, that's indicating soil moisture layers, or perhaps rocky layers. So coming back to that katina, sorting soils and water down a slope, you start seeing these tracts of green sort of lines. That's, especially in the dry season, that's signaling drainage or groundwater influence. And then the other one that we often look at is where you have sharp vegetation edges. And that can actually be a geological thing where you've got a sudden abrupt change of soil. It can be historic land use, or it can be fire history, so especially if these are control burns and there are fire breaks that have been burned. You'll often get this sort of straight line, which will persist even if the grass has grown back. So this is an example in Hwange National Park in Zimbabwe. And you can see there's a very abrupt line between grass and no grass. And part of that is caused by a soil change from more sandy to more clay. In this instance, it's also relatively close to a waterhole, so there's an element of trampling. But as you can see, it's a very, very distinctive line, which separates two zones quite markedly. So why do patterns matter? I mean, does this have any relevance to you as a guest going out into the African wild on a safari? And I'd like to think that it does, in that if you learn to read the land, you're going to be able to better predict what you're going to find. So things like, is it green and lush? Probably you're going to find some bulk grazers, buffalo, zebra, rhino. Water-dependent animals, so these are animals that are dependent to drink water absolutely every day. So you're going to find things, you'll also find buffalo here, but elephants, waterbuck, hippos, so a whole group of animals. Crest and sandy soils, cheetahs like high areas. Lions will often also go up because it gives them visibility over an area that they can then scan for prey. Termite mounds, nutrient hotspots, so areas where you have very nutritious grasses, and also areas that can be used for animals like kudu, for example. You'll often see a kudu bull standing on top of a termite mound. Might be for grazing, but might also be for something called static optic advertising, which is a dominance display that male kudus do. And then burn edges. Obviously, once an area has been burned and the first rains come, the first green shoots that come through are highly nutritious. So you'll find things like wildebeest, impala. Those animals will often congregate, and it's why on smaller reserves, when you do controlled burns, you actually need to burn areas that are big enough so as not to allow areas that you've burned to become completely overgrazed the minute that the grass starts coming through. So I spoke a lot more about termite mounds on my last presentation, but I just wanted to kind of highlight again. So you have this sort of core, and as you saw, that's where often cheetahs will find themselves perched on top of. Then that is the actual chimney for these fungus-growing termites. You often have this green halo around it, halo effect, because the grasses there are highly nutritive, and so you get it gets grazed much more intensively, and so you get this layer of shorter grass. And it also forms a little area of what we would call microclimate modification. It's changing the environment in that little area to make it more attractive to certain species. This bull is doing what I was saying. He wasn't particularly interested in the trees growing there. He wasn't browsing, but he was a big bull, and he's advertising that he's a big, strong male, and he's using a termite mound to do that. So we spoke about grazing lawns and ungrazed grass, and that grass height actually gives you a message. So short grass can be high quality regrowth. It's not always damage. It can be as a result of damage, but it can also be because there's a lot of nutrients. You've got a positive feedback loop. So grazing keeps it short. More grazers, there's a lot more dung, so it fertilizes the soil, and so you get into this loop that keeps these grasses green. So that's your short grazing lawn. And then your tall ungrazed grass, so this is the grass I spoke about earlier that very often will have lower digestibility, but there's a lot of it, and so bulk grazers will eat it. Ambush predators, so leopards, love these types of environment. Very often this tall grass is interspersed with small shrubs, and it's a perfect hiding zone for pounce predators like leopards. It also is the biomass when we talk about fires. So when we look at burning savanna areas, savannas and fires are basically evolved together, for want of a better expression. And it's not the woody matter that creates your burns. It's actually how much grass fuel load do you have, which will indicate what sort of a burn you're going to get. And so all of those are important and tell their own story when you're looking at these environments. So the same goes for trees. So you'll not infrequently see a browse line on trees. And it quite literally looks like somebody went with a pair of garden scissors and cut a straight line. And those lines will be at different heights depending on which animals have been grazing. Sometimes you get an hourglass shape from where giraffe have reached a certain browse height, but they're not able to browse above it. Sometimes caused by kudu, you get a straight line. Impalas also, because they're mixed feeders, can create these browse lines. And so when you're looking at these areas, you'll start to see the patterns that evolve because these animals have preferred trees. So a high preference for things like giraffe are acacias. They're very high in nitrogen. They're very nutritious. And so follow the grazed leaves or the browse leaves, and there you'll find your giraffe. So this is a young giraffe, and as you can see, the browse line like I explained, it looks like it's been cut with a pair of scissors. This young giraffe will have contributed to that, but so would have kudu, for example, because it's kind of at the right height for kudus to graze or browse. So I said that fire and savanna are really hand in glove with each other. And it's incredible always to me how an area that has been burned, which looks black and dead, within a very short period of time, you suddenly start to get these bright green, nutrient-rich grasses. And this will bring animals from huge distances. Grazers will certainly come to these areas because of these nutritive areas. Fire creates a mosaic, and I'll show you in the next slide. Mosaics of landscapes are basically areas where you have short grass, you've got longer grass, you've got trees, you've got areas that have been burned, and it's a patchwork quilt. And that's an environment where it's a very heterogeneous environment, and that promotes diversity. And then predators often will use the cover of unburned grass. So they'll hang out in the areas that are unburned and wait for animals that will definitely be attracted, herbivores, to these grazing areas, and then use it as an area to hunt from. So this was just an interesting illustration I found. And what it's showing really is that the most recently burned area has got the highest forage quality. And that's the area that these animals are all aggregating on. And as you go to the areas with the longest time since a burn, the forage quality decreases, and the plant biomass and height will increase. And so those are the areas, and very often when we burn in rotations, often of 3 years. And so an area that was burned now will then only be burnt again in 3 years' time, and it will have gone through this cycle. If you burn too frequently, you can then damage the environment. So it really is a balancing act. So this is the mosaic principle I was alluding to. So landscapes are patchwork. It's a patchwork, and everywhere is at a different stage. It's obviously not as nicely segmented as in this infographic, but I think it gives a good illustration of talking about patterns in landscapes. So you've got your riparian corridors where you've got things like your elephants, you've got some of your big storks or herons. You've got a termite mound, which is this area of this nutrient-rich hotspot. You've got an area of tall, dry grassland, and that's often things like secretary birds, for example. They will often hunt in these areas. They're expert snake hunters, but they'll also take a variety of other creatures. But they favor these kind of tall, dry grassland areas. Then you've got these burnt areas where you've got rain that has brought some of these bright green nutrients to the surface. And these are the areas where things like wildebeest will be attracted. And then you've got your grazing lawns, which in this kind of scenario would probably have been last season's burnt areas that have recovered and have gone through this kind of nutrient feedback loop of being grazed and then dung and the whole cycle continuing. And then you've got this more open woodland area, which is the areas where you're going to start finding things like your giraffe that are favoring these trees that are growing. This is quite typical, especially of Southern African savanna. So when you look at East African savannas, those are much more what we would call a parkland savanna. And so they look a little more homogeneous, a lot more area of huge grass areas, and then these sort of riparian corridors. But there will still be these areas interspersed of open woodland and so on, but probably not as extensively as you would see in Southern Africa. And this mosaic is what boosts your overall biodiversity, and it also creates resilience in the environment, because not everything is at the same stage, so not everything is exposed to the same pressures. So this was a lioness who, I don't know exactly why she was lying in the middle of a burnt area, but they were, this was in the Sabi Sands, and the whole pride actually had come and decided that they were going to lie down in this burnt area. Interesting behavior. Again, they don't read the textbooks. There was no ways that they were going to be able to hunt from there because they were so highly visible. But it happens. Ecotones, these are areas in the landscape where it's a transition zone between a wooded area and a more open savanna area. And these ecotones are often areas that support much higher biodiversity than the areas on either side of them. Some animals become sort of what we would call ecotone specialists. So animals like impala, for example, really like these ecotones. They're both grazers and browsers. And so this environment for them is an ideal combination. Often because you have an open area with a more wooded area close by, it's also a very good area to look for predators. Leopards in particular love these kind of areas, especially if it's close to water, because that combination is a kind of herbivore magnet, and so their chances of catching something in this environment are high. And then when we look at the open savannas, like I said, we need to start looking at, so is this boundary, if we have boundaries that have been created, is it driven by sharp changes in the soil, like sand moving to clay, or is it disturbance driven? Are these fire scars, grazing limits creating these shifting edges? So again, it starts making us as guides or as nature enthusiasts starting to read the landscape rather than just looking at the animals that we see, but not really understanding why we are seeing them, where we're seeing them. So this was my example of impalas being ecotone specialists. So as you can see, this impala has got some form of broad-leafed plant in its mouth. It's not a grass. And it's one of the reasons that impalas are so successful. There's a number of others, but their ability to switch from browsing to grazing or vice versa makes them a lot more resilient to environmental changes like drought, for example, where grass disappears, but there's still some broadleaf trees. Unlike things like wildebeest, which are grazers, and once drought happens, they are unable to shift. And so it has a much more serious impact on them than it does on something like an impala. And again, I mentioned this concept of ecotones being a fantastic area for predators. So this is a classic example. This photograph also taken in the Sabi Sands of this young leopard that was doing exactly that, because where we were sitting on the other side was a much more open area, and this leopard had been kind of actively stalking through this area, which was, much more thick, and therefore gave it a lot more cover. And then this was just my way of looking at, you need to look at both the sort of close scale, if you will, so what's right underneath your feet. So can you see tracks? Can you see what this duiker is eating? Can you see what this francolin was scratching around looking for? So you've got textures and signs right under your feet almost. And then just looking at a slight distance, so you start to see, are there termite mounds? In this particular case, there was a very large lion on top of the termite mound. But are there grazing lawns? So where this bird is sitting, there's obviously a much smaller termite mound there, but there's a beautiful grazing lawn around it. So what features can you see? And then looking at much further scales, looking again for that far away or much further comparison, looking at the whole landscape. So grasses, looking in this environment, like in Wangi, where you have these palm trees, can you see repeating patterns? Is there an area here where you've got flatter open areas, you've started to get more green ridges behind it? So what are the bands and patterns? So you're looking from a local scale, and then slowly moving out to see, is there a trend? Is there something overall here that you can start to put as part of an answer to a puzzle? And then finally, 4 questions maybe to ask to help you predict, where will grazers, browsers, birds, predators, where will they be? So what is the water flow? What are the soils like? Because as we said right in the beginning, when we looked at the Katina, that soil determines what plants can grow and therefore what animals you will find there. Are there islands of fertility? Are there termite mounds or any sort of deposits that are creating nutritive hotspots? And then, is there disturbance that will give you things like, are there regrowth patches which are going to support things like wildebeest? So are there signs of disturbance that are going to also help you work out what animals are going to be where? And so you're moving from looking at it from an ecological perspective, and you're putting that into a viewing strategy. And so you're not just seeing the animals, you're seeing the places that make their existence possible. And I think from a safari experience, to my mind, that's a far more enriching experience than just looking at animals in a landscape and not having any knowledge of why they're there. So thank you, Rob. That's the end of the formal presentation. I'm happy to try and answer questions if anyone has.
All right. Thank you so much, Lorraine. So before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, please feel free to submit them via the question field in your control panel, just go to the upper right-hand corner, hit those 3 lines, and that should open up the fields, including questions. All right, so let's dive into it. So how do people keep fire from getting out of hand and burning too much of the land? And how do they protect the animals from the fire in those controlled burning areas?
So when we do control burns, you first of all you create what we call fire breaks. So those may be areas that are mown, so the grass is taken down very short, so there's no fuel load. Sometimes we will put in tracer lines and then burn those tracer lines, and that would then prevent fire jumping. Often we'll use roads, and we'll burn in blocks with roads as boundaries. And when you burn these areas, you never burn in a tight or a closed circle, for example. You always leave open areas that would function as escape routes for animals should they need to move away from the fire. So we're also very careful on what type of days we burn. There are some days that our fire associations will consider red days. Those are very hot, windy days. You're not permitted to burn on those days because the risk of jumping in those environments is high. And then as we burn, we actually, as the front of the fire moves through, you have a mop-up crew coming behind. And they actually have beaters and fire hoses to suppress that burn so that you don't find yourself in a situation where it potentially gets out of control. That's not to say that jumps, unfortunately, don't sometimes happen, but it's something that is as controlled as it can be.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. And do you worry too much about naturally occurring fire danger from lightning or other sources happening a lot? Is that something you deal with?
So no. So I mean, something called patch mosaic burning has become a much more popular way of burning in recent years, and it mimics lightning strikes. So in that instance, you'll have a lightning strike which will set fire to perhaps a dry area, but it'll run quite quickly into an area that's wetter, and that fire will go out. And so a lot of our control burns are trying now to mimic that because it creates that mosaic landscape. So obviously, where we would intervene from a lightning strike fire is, if it's close to buildings or there's any risk, direct risk to life, then obviously we would have to move in and extinguish those fires. But otherwise, lightning fires are left to burn.
Thank you. So in Australia, one of our guests is saying that they're using more and more what are called cool burns. They don't get as hot. Is that something that is a strategy that's being used in South Africa?
Yeah, so the type of burn that you put through depends on what your objective is. So by that I mean, if you're wanting to remove very dense bush encroachment, so lots of woody material that shouldn't be there, you burn a really hot fire because that's the only thing that will knock those trees back. If you're just wishing or wanting to get rid of grass that is moribund, so that's dead grass, and you want to create new flushes of grass coming through, you push through what we would call a cool burn. So it depends on your objective. I think one of the challenges they have in places like Australia is where you have things like eucalypts, which contain huge amounts of gum. If you now have fires that get into the eucalypts, the intensity of those fires is extreme. And it's one of the problems we've started seeing in South Africa in the fynbos in the Cape. Fynbos also needs fire to regenerate, but not the temperatures of fire that are generated because we have eucalypts growing there now. And so I think the whole concept of cool fire is basically restorative, rather than trying to get rid of, for example, encroachment. So that's how we would essentially look at it.
Gotcha. Thank you for explaining that. So you showed a picture of a lion. It was lying on the burnt area of the ground. I'm assuming that the ground was still not warm, or would it be warm?
No, no, that fire had been out for quite some time. It was actually it was a fire break that they had burned. And as I say, unusual behavior. It's not something that I've regularly seen predators do. But they just plonk themselves down in the middle of this burnt area. So they're highly exposed. I mean, they're not going to be able to hunt from there. But yes, they didn't get the textbook.
Huh. It is fascinating that they would just lie down in the middle of an open area like that. It's interesting. No fear, I guess, from the lion. So when we're driving around out there in our transport vehicles, the four-wheel drives, do they have much of an impact on the land?
So it's a very good question. And so, yes, it does have some impact. So there are a certain number of regulations that control what we would consider off-road driving. So obviously many of these areas have roads that you are driving on. But if you're now going to drive off the roads into the bush, there are some areas where it's not permitted. So seep lines, for example, are sensitive. Sodic areas, very sensitive soils, not permitted. If areas have had over a certain amount of rainfall, off-road driving is not permitted. So it's one of those things that if you think about the fact that you've got a 2-ton vehicle driving off-road, there is a certain amount of damage, and that needs to be mitigated. So what is an acceptable amount and what is not? And I think, it's so long as you're not creating 1,000,001 new tracks that are going to be there for the next 100 years, which can happen when people, go off-road in sand dunes, for example. So it's something that really needs to be controlled. And it's something in terms of ethical guiding, I think that for me is really important.
Gotcha. Thank you for talking about that. So if we're out there and we're on safari and we see a herd of elephants, can we assume that there is water in the area?
Look, elephants can move vast distances to get to water. But yes, there will be a supply of water. Now, whether that's water that you can see or whether that's water, for example, in the dry season, in these riverbeds, the elephants will often dig holes to drink water from. So elephants like clean water. They don't like dirty, stagnant water. And if there is dirty water, they'll actually rather dig to filter water through the sand in order to drink it. But yes, you can pretty much be assured that somewhere within probably a 5-10 kilometer radius, there is water because they absolutely need to drink every day.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for talking about this. Just such a fascinating topic. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us, Lorraine.
Just to say thank you again, Rob. As always, it's great to be able to share something of this work that I'm privileged to do, and that, I hope that it gives guests that come on safari a greater insight into what's happening. So thank you.
And thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. We learned a heck of a lot, so we really do appreciate that. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab to South Africa, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on the website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. So long, everybody. We'll see you next time.